Welcome to Module 2. In this module, we're going to define the learning objectives, and we'll do this using the backward design approach. It is important to remember that this stage of backward design begins with defining the learning objectives, and it will inform our assessment as well as our learning activities. Backward design is a methodology focused on student learning, and it will help us to have a clear goal in mind for students. Speaking of having clear learning objectives, these are the learning objectives for Module 2. We're going to frame learning and understanding and help that connect it to how do we write learning objectives, and then we're going to show how the learning objectives can be unpacked and fit a big idea and essential questions, and literally how do we write learning objectives. So let's begin by starting with defining learning objectives. Overall, you'll see that we begin by helping to identify, well, what would students need to know to demonstrate understanding for the content that you're going to teach and help the students to apply. We'll define learning objectives by unpacking the educational standards and showing how the learning objectives, which are going to be fairly specific, actually fit within a big idea. We'll then define what the learning goals are for the course, and then we'll have specific learning objectives for the lessons or the days in which we teach students in a class. So let's begin by looking at student understanding. Student understanding can be represented by interpreting, if students can interpret the information, if they can explain it, if they can use it, if they could summarize the information, or if they can prove with some type of logical sequence, if they can make connections with the content. They also might be asked to generalize the content, make predictions, or give examples of how the knowledge is applied in the real world. So we'll think about how to develop student understanding. And we'll do this by helping students to be able to make an explanation of the knowledge. So if they can explain something, then they're demonstrating understanding. If they could interpret something or share an interpretation, that's another way of demonstrating understanding. If they could apply the knowledge, is another way for them to demonstrate understanding. If they could communicate and share multiple perspectives about the knowledge. And finally, if they can demonstrate empathy regarding the concepts or how the knowledge is affecting people in the real world. So we'll walk through these and just talk about ways that instructors can help students to reach each of these types of understanding. So number one, nurturing the ability to explain is asking a couple key questions that are driven by why, which could be, what is the cause of this? What happens if I do this? Or what do you think if I tried something different and did a different approach? It also could be having students to explain the how. How does this work? And how do you get to this conclusion? The second level of understanding is encouraging students to interpret or provide an interpretation. And this can be done by asking questions. What does this mean? What is this related to? Why does this matter? And how is this related to me? Number three, create opportunities to help students apply the knowledge by asking these questions. Where can I learn this? How can I use this information? How can I solve the problem? And how can I adapt it to the situation? Number four is looking for different perspectives. This could be asking students these questions. What do you think about this? How about looking at it this way? Why do you think this is so? And is this reasonable? For empathy, you can help students develop empathy by asking, what do they see that I don't? What is this person thinking or feeling, and why when he did this or she did this? And what do I need to experience to understand what the person has experienced? So empathy is really important, and it's helping students to see things also from another perspective. Number 6, encouraging self-knowledge. And so this is really helping the students to also understand how they fit into this learning experience. And so how does this shape my views, or who I am, my identity shape my views? And what are my limits? What are my blind spots? And what biases might I have that influence how I have learned this information and understand this concept? A lot of this around empathy and self-knowledge is relevant today as we think about social injustice in our society and how that might fit some of our courses on our campuses. So helping students develop their understanding in the classrooms begins with engaging students to think about their previous knowledge, and then helping them to integrate the new knowledge to what they already know. And this really ties into constructivism, which is we try to initiate the conversation with what students know and then help build on their previous knowledge. And so that's the idea of constructing new knowledge, is based upon what students already know about those concepts. You can do this by using cues, asking questions, or providing advanced organizers, worksheets that they may follow as you walk through the scaffolding process of learning this. Non-linguistic representations would be using something that doesn't have words in it and helping them see maybe a framework or a model. The next one is summarizing and taking notes and helping them understand how to think about what they're learning in a way that would make sense to them and try to put it into their own words. And number 4 there is assigning homework and then giving them the opportunity to really practice what you were wanting them to get in the course. So when we think about defining the learning objectives, we focus on understanding at a little higher level, but we then break that down into 3 steps. Unpacking the educational standards by helping to think about the specific knowledge as it fits within a big idea. We also then help them to identify or communicate to them what the learning goal is within this course at a little higher level. This also is representative of identifying the learning outcomes of a course. And then finally, more specifically, as you engage students in learning and meeting the learning objectives, you'll do this by having more specific learning objectives for your lessons on specific days of class. So let's just walk through these steps. First step is unpacking the educational standards. In your field, you may have some educational standards, or you may think about what are you preparing students for in the real world. So industry may have standards as well. So as you think about what is this course trying to accomplish, would be one way to start to think about the bigger picture. What are the priorities? There's a lot that needs to be taught, but really if you had to maybe reduce it to maybe a third of what you have on your list, then what would be the top priorities that you would teach? This is then represented by these questions: what to teach, and thinking about what to leave out. So what the priorities of what's important, and then you'll also focus on what do you want to emphasize, and maybe spend a little bit more time on, and maybe what do you want to minimize or spend less time on. So how do we prioritize information or the content in our course? And we do this by thinking about really starting with, well, what's the big idea? So the big idea is hard to think about. So a lot of times, so what I do is I ask students to think about what's important to know and do. And that center is really a good entrance point into beginning the conversation. So let's say I'm working with a student in food science, and so we think about, well, what is important in introductory food science course? It might be, well, students need to understand calories and where their calories come from. So that could be important to know and do. It's also fairly accessible to think about, okay, in what context? So what would be worth being familiar with superficial knowledge, but you wouldn't necessarily try to, you wouldn't assess them on this knowledge. So that would be, well, how many calories are in a box of cereal or in one serving of cereal? And what's the difference between perhaps the serving if you used 1% milk, the calories in 1% milk versus the calories in 2% milk? So that's good to be familiar with, but you wouldn't necessarily want to assess them on how many calories are in those servings. And then as you then go back to where you initially maybe were drawn to, and that is that center dot called the big idea. Okay, what are the key concepts here? Why do we need to know calories? Well, calories play into this idea of energy. It's a unit of representation of how energy is transferred from a food source to being metabolized by humans. It also fits the big idea of nutritional, perhaps food and nutritional security. So what are our needs as people, and where are those sources of food energies that we can get, and how can we do that in a sustainable and healthy way? So hopefully that example helps to demonstrate how to think through prioritizing your content. And this slide is really important for a lot of professors to start to break down what is important, how do I start to connect the pieces, and really if I have to think about just one thing that the students are going to leave my class at the end of the semester or this end of this learning experience, what it is that I really want them to take away as the key understanding. So a little bit more about the big idea as we now dive into the different parts of prioritization. The big idea is, what is the main point? What is the major idea? Beyond just, okay, what's that basic knowledge that students need to know? So in the bigger picture, what is it that you want them to think about and see on a larger scale? Speaking of scale, it's broad and it's more abstract. So sometimes it requires you to uncover or have uncoverage, which really means you'll cover less information because you're trying to get students to think beyond just the content you're teaching in the course and help them see how is this relevant in the bigger picture. Is it universal in application? So typically if you find concepts and big ideas, they span a lot of different contexts. It just won't be the specific major or the discipline that you find your students in or yourself in. It's also timeless, and so this is something that has existed across many generations and has existed for many different years across periods of time. Of course, with the technology, it might change a little bit because that's more of a recent invention or phenomena, but the idea is that this would probably continue beyond even into the future. It is transferable, which means it can be applied in many different contexts and other situations. And so the idea of energy isn't just related to food, but it's related to maybe electrical energy, chemical energy, and other forms of energy. How do you find the big idea? Some questions you might ask yourself as you're in the planning mode is, why study this? So what? Why is this important? You might think about what is the moral of the story of this topic. So what's the message behind what you're trying to teach? Do you have to dig deep to understand the meaning and the implications of this knowledge? What is the larger concept? Kind of reading between the lines. What is it that you're trying to help the students see that may not be there upon first glance? What couldn't we do if we didn't understand this? So why is this so important? So if we didn't do this, we would not be able to do what? And then how is this used in the real world? And how is it used in the real world in multiple contexts? So across different domains, and that will help you to think about where and how to find the big idea of your content for your course. Step 2 is thinking about defining the learning goals. So at the end of the course, students will be able to, and we finish the sentence. So these are written at a little larger level because it's at your scope is at the course, and so you'll think about what are the key concepts, or what are the big ideas and key concepts that you want to be represented here. And so you might have just one overarching big idea, excuse me, and you'll have then that represented by maybe 3 to 5, 6 goals that tie this all together. And so as we mentioned, the big idea might be nutritional security, and we may have a number of goals in our course that learning objectives, but learning goals and learning outcomes that do represent and make up and contribute to that big idea. So number 3 is then defining the specific objectives. And so let me back up to step 2. I just wanted to clarify that those learning goals are really represented by the understandings that we started with at the beginning of this module. So when you write goals, I have found it very useful to just think about, what do I want students to be able to explain? What do I want them to interpret? What do I want them to apply? So you're thinking about it at a little larger level. As you then go to step 3, we're thinking about specific learning objectives. And this probably happens more at the lesson level or maybe at the week level of your course. So as we break this down, you'll see that big ideas are represented by the learning goals that we just talked about. These are the understandings that you will identify and express in the form of learning outcomes. And then more specifically, these goals will be represented by the key concepts and skills that students would learn in the form of learning objectives. And these will be written in more behavioral terms. And so you'll see that one example would be, I want students to be able to calculate calories in their maybe their average or typical lunch. And so that could be a very specific behavioral objective. The learning goals, as we said, are more of a constructivist understanding level. And so that's how we bring these together. We also define specific learning objectives by thinking about the specific behaviors students will do, as well as specific action verbs. So these action verbs are represented by what will students literally be able to do to demonstrate they understand what you were asking them to accomplish. Those learning objectives then fit into course goals, which are at a little higher level. They represent more of this, what we call student outcomes, learning outcomes. These are broad, a little bit more general or vague, and they reflect essential questions for the course, which then tie into representing then the big idea. So as you can see, there's just level of specificity, learning objectives, a little broader, the course goals, which would reflect learning outcomes, and all that then contributes to, okay, what's the big idea that this connects to the bigger picture? So as we think about keywords and the action verbs that you would use. You can turn to Bloom's taxonomy, and you'll see that there's different levels of the taxonomy here that demonstrate remembering is recalling facts and basic concepts, understanding is explaining ideas or concepts, and underneath each of these you'll see some of the verbs that you could actually use to write your learning objectives. So you'll see apply, using the information in new situations. An example of a verb would be to demonstrate. Analyze would be drawing connections among ideas, and a key word could be to compare and contrast. Evaluate is to really justify a stand or decision, and perhaps this could be to defend, and you could add your content after that. And then the last one would be create, at the point of this taxonomy, and this is the idea of producing something new or original work. And so the first one on the list there is to design, and that could be like a specific project you want your students to create in your course. So how do you write these learning objectives? What you'll do is you'll simply pick an action verb. So we've listed a few there below action verbs: to define, and then you'll have a direct object that would follow that. And so you could say you want the students to define what food energy means. That would be an example. To define, and then food energy would be the direct object that follows that. You'll see that students will be able to define these terms, or they'll be able to develop a model. These are examples of learning objectives that you could develop for your course. So here's an example of a practice. So among the learning objectives listed below, please identify the ones that are not clear and write down reasons in the box on the right. So we've listed 4 different examples there. Which of these, which are relevant to what we're doing here in this module, which of these might not be clear, and how would we change that? So the first one, understand, backward design, that could be the idea of a more general, because the word understand is being used. So that's probably a course goal, not a learning objective. So we would replace the word understand to make it more specific with to explain, backward design. So that is a correction that we could make there. Be aware. Awareness is a very general idea, and so instead we would replace that with identify the learner-centered characteristics. Create engaging learning activities. That one you would see was in the creating, was in the list of specific behavioral verbs, so that would work. Apply learner-centered teaching was also in the list of Bloom's taxonomy, and so that one would be fine as well. But we would change 1 and 2 to be more specific using verbs that come from the verb will based upon the revised Bloom's taxonomy. So this slide here shows that remembering has specific, you can pull from the specific words there in the center of this diagram. Understanding, you can see distinguish, illustrate, restate. Applying, you could choose organize, show. Analyzing would be compare or classify or prioritize. So these are just more specific verbs that you would use to try to demonstrate the levels of Bloom's taxonomy as you write your learning objectives. So learning questions are really a great way to take learning objectives and just reframing them in the form of questions, because this will help students to think about answering those and engaging them in knowing if they have actually answered the question. So it points out specific objectives. One question should include more than one objective, and then it will help, these learning questions will help drive the content of each session and students should be able to answer the essential questions then as you pull this together for the overall course. The process to design learning activities, as you can see, is you begin by thinking about the bigger picture. What is student understanding? And unpacking the educational standards, as well as identifying and framing the big idea. You'll then think about what are the learning goals and those learning outcomes to help students connect to the big idea. And then you'll think more specifically as you build your lessons, you'll identify what are the specific learning objectives and learning questions as you use action verbs and direct objects to answer those questions. The process to write learning objectives, as you can see, fits into this framework. The objectives are at the lowest level, most specific, with then making up and contributing to having goals for your course. And then, of course, there's one overarching big idea that you'll have for the course that you teach your students. So in summary, our goal was to answer these questions. This is a good example of learning questions as they connected to what we wanted to accomplish as learning objectives. Is how did we frame learning or understanding? And then, of course, defining course goals as well as objectives, unpacking educational standards and thinking about the big ideas, identifying essential questions that reflect what those learning goals are for a course that relate to the big ideas, and then how do we more specifically write learning objectives. So as we conclude this module, you can extend your learning by going to these references and resources, and we hope that you'll enjoy this educational experience as you become a learner-centered teacher.